There's a fact people love to throw down like a trump card the moment a conversation turns to slavery. Black people owned slaves too. They say it to end the argument, to suggest that if black people did it as well, then maybe it was never really about race at all. And it is true that there were black slave owners. The records prove it, but when you actually follow those black slave owners through the documents and back through their own DNA, the truth that comes back is nothing like the gotcha people reach for. It is stranger and sadder, and instead of letting everyone off the hook, it tightens the noose around the whole system. Because most of these people were hiding something the trump card version desperately needs you not to see. And it is the very opposite of what you would guess. Let's anchor this in the real record, because this is a topic where bad information travels fast and on purpose. The foundational source is the historian Carter G. Woodson, the father of black history himself, who went through the 1830 census and actually counted them. Roughly 3,775 free black people, who on paper owned around 12,100 enslaved people. That is the number you have heard quoted, usually with no context attached to it whatsoever. For the specific lives behind it, we have rigorous scholarship. Michael Johnson and James Rourke's book, Black Masters, the definitive study of the Ellison family of South Carolina, and Gary Mills's The Forgotten People, the standard history of the Creoles of color along Louisiana's Cane River. And to trace these families back to where they truly began, we have genealogy and the DNA of their living descendants. Put the number, the histories, and the genetics together, and you can finally separate the myth from the truth, which is exactly what the people who wave this fact around never want you to do. Who were the black slave owners, really? Not the clean rebuttal the internet wants them to be. The honest answer comes in layers, and the very first layer dissolves most of the gotcha before we even reach the genuinely hard part. Because for the large majority of the people on Woodson's list, the word owner does not mean anything close to what you have been led to assume. Here is the first truth, and it is the one the trump card version is built to bury. In the slave states, the law followed a chilling principle inherited from colonial Virginia, written in Latin, partus sequitur ventrum, that the child follows the womb. It meant a child's free or enslaved status was determined entirely by the mothers. So if a free black man loved and married an enslaved woman, the law declared their children slaves from birth, no matter that their father was free. And if that man wanted to protect his own wife and his own children, there was often only one legal route available to him. He had to buy them. He had to purchase his family out of another man's possession and hold the title to them himself. And here is the cruelty layered on top of that cruelty. He frequently could not then set them free because the slave states made emancipation almost impossible on purpose. In South Carolina, a law in 1800 required that a panel of white men certify a freed person could support themselves before any manumission was allowed, a requirement no one could meet for a small child. Then the Act of 1820 banned private manumission outright. To free a single human being, you now had to petition both houses of the state legislature and win their approval, one person at a time. The doors to freedom were being deliberately welded shut precisely to keep the free black population from growing. So a free black father could buy his wife and children and then find himself legally trapped as their owner, unable to release them, holding the people he loved most as property because the state would not let him do anything else. And it was worse than just being stuck, because holding your family as property put them in real danger. Property could be seized. If a free black man fell into debt or died or simply ran afoul of the wrong white official, the human beings he held on paper, his own wife, his own children, could be confiscated and sold at auction to satisfy a court scattered to plantations across the South with no way back. To own your family in that world was not power. It was a desperate, defensive crouch, a way of keeping them close and praying nothing went wrong. That is who a great many of the names on Woodson's list actually were. Not masters, husbands and fathers and mothers, owning the people they were trying to save in the only language of ownership a cruel system would recognize, This is exactly where DNA and genealogy cut through the myth, because they let us see what those census records were really describing. When researchers reconstruct these families, tracing the documented bloodlines and confirming them through the DNA of living descendants, the slaves listed in a free black household over and over turn out to be the household's own kin. The enslaved woman a free black man owned was, on the genealogical record, his wife. The enslaved children were his children. The genome of their descendants today carries the proof these were not an owner and his human property in any ordinary sense. They were one family, with a deed of sale standing in for a marriage license because the law forbade the real thing. Think about what the census taker actually wrote down when he listed a free black man as the owner of 3 slaves, and those 3 slaves were the man's own wife and 2 daughters. The document says property, the DNA says family, and the gap between those 2 words is the exact space where the comfortable myth tries to live and where the truth evicts it. A modern descendant who takes a DNA test and matches closely to the descendants of the very people their ancestor owned is not discovering a master and his chattel. They are discovering cousins, one bloodline that a deed of sale had pretended to split in 2. Even the famous William Ellison, before he became anything else, did this first. April Ellison, born enslaved in South Carolina around 1790, apprenticed as a cotton gin maker, bought his own freedom in 1816, and the very next thing he did in 1817 was buy his enslaved wife Matilda and their daughter, specifically so that their future children would be born free. His first act as a free man who could purchase a human being was to purchase his way toward his own family's freedom. For most people in this story, that is where it began and ended. But honesty cuts both ways. And now we reach the part that the other side of this argument wants buried just as badly, because a smaller number of these people were not protecting family at all. They were in it for profit, and they were as ruthless as any white planter in the South. William Ellison is the towering example, and his story does not let anyone feel comfortable. After freeing his own family, Ellison did not stop there. He built a cotton gin manufacturing business so successful that white planters across the region depended on his machines, and he poured the profits into land and into people. By 1860, he owned around 60 enslaved human beings and 900 acres of cotton land, making him one of the wealthiest men of any color in his part of the state, and by far the largest of the roughly 170 free black slaveholders in all of South Carolina. He worked those people for profit exactly as his white neighbors worked theirs. By the documented record, he was a hard, calculating master who ran his plantation for maximum return and did not extend to the people he owned the mercy that had once been extended to him. And when the Civil War came, Ellison and his sons threw their weight behind the Confederacy, turning over their cotton fields to grow food for the rebel armies, donating money to the cause, a grandson marching off in a Confederate uniform. Sid with the full arc of that. The man who began his free life by buying his own wife out of bondage ended it as a planter, materially defending the very institution that had once owned him. He had been a victim of the system and became an investor in it. And he was not alone. Far to the south, along Louisiana's Cane River, stood one of the most remarkable free families of color in all of America, the descendants of a woman named Marie-Thérèse Coinsoin. They became wealthy planters, the Matoya family, holding large estates worked by enslaved people across several generations. And the historical record is honest that they ran those plantations as their white counterparts did, even hiring slave catchers to hunt down the people who tried to escape them. There is no evidence they were gentler owners than anyone else of their class. The enslaved men, women, and children who labored and suffered under black masters like the Matoyers and the Ellisons were every bit as enslaved, every bit as brutalized, and they deserve to be remembered as real human victims, not quietly erased because the color of their owners complicates a tidy story. Honest history does not flinch from this. Some free black people, handed the chance to climb in a society that worshiped wealth measured in human beings, took it and became exploiters of other black people. That is true, and it is ugly, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie, no better than the one this video is here to dismantle. So does that vindicate the trump card? Does the existence of a William Ellison prove that slavery was never really about race? It proves the exact opposite, and this is the heart of the whole matter. Look at the cage. Even the richest black slave owner lived inside. William Ellison, with his 60 slaves and his 900 acres and his fortune, was still required by South Carolina law to have a white guardian, a white man legally appointed to vouch for him, because as a free black man, he could not be trusted to manage his own existence in the eyes of the state. At his own church, his family was permitted a single pew at the back of the main floor as a special favor, while every other black worshiper was confined to the gallery above. His white customers routinely tried to cheat him out of payment for the gins he built them, knowing a black man had little legal recourse to collect. And as the war approached and white anxiety about free black people curdled into open hostility and new restrictions, even Ellison, wealthy, respected, a slaveholder himself, considered fleeing the South entirely because he could feel the ground giving way beneath his feet. He had bought and built and clawed his way to the absolute top of what a black man was permitted to reach in that society, and the ceiling was still pressed down inches above his head. His Confederate loyalty was not only greed, it was also camouflage, the desperate calculation of a man whose safety depended entirely on convincing white power that he was on his side. That is the truth, the gotcha. Cannot survive. American slavery was not a club that black people were free to join on equal terms. It was a racial caste system so total that it could permit a few thousand exceptions and lose nothing at all. The 4 million human beings held in bondage were black. The power that owned them made the laws, ran the auctions, patrolled the roads, and wrote the Constitution that protected all of it was white. A few thousand black slaveholders, most of them owning their own families to keep them safe, a small number owning others for profit, and every single one of them living at the sufferance of white power and stripped of rights the poorest illiterate white man took for granted. That does not dilute the racial nature of slavery by a single drop. It demonstrates how absolute that system truly was. It was strong enough to take some of its own victims and bend them for a generation into its instruments. The existence of black slave owners is not evidence that slavery wasn't about race. It is some of the starkest evidence there is of how completely race organized everything in that world, right down to the exceptions it allowed. A quick pause, because cutting through exactly this kind of weaponized half-truth is the whole reason this channel exists, the documented record, the real genetics, and the full context, with no comfortable myth from any direction and no cheap point scoring. If that's the work you want more of, subscribe, because the most twisted stories in American history are usually the ones that have been deliberately flattened into a slogan. Now let me trace this all the way back, because the DNA has one more truth to tell, and it is the deepest one of all. Here is where the genetics deliver the final, quiet devastation of the myth. Follow the Cane River dynasty. All that wealth, all those plantations, all those enslaved people, back up its own family tree, and it narrows, in just a generation or two, to a single woman. Marie-Thérèse Coinsoin was born in 1742, not free, but enslaved in the French outpost of Natchitoches. Her mother and father were Africans, held in bondage, and her very name carries the proof across the ocean. Coin appears to be a name from the Glidzi or Ewe-speaking peoples of West Africa, a name her family carried out of the homeland and kept alive even in slavery. A small, unbroken thread back to the continent. She was, by descent and by the DNA her thousands of descendants still carry, a daughter of West and West Central Africa, of the same Congo, an Angolan and Guinea Coast world that filled the holds of the slave ships bound for the American South. The matriarch of one of the greatest black slave-holding families in American history was herself born a slave, an enslaved African woman, freed only because the Frenchman who owned her fell in love with her and bought her loose. And that is the pattern hiding underneath nearly every name on Woodson's list. Trace the black slave owners back even a generation or two, and you do not find some separate caste that arrived from somewhere else. You find the formerly enslaved. You find Africans and the children of Africans, people whose own DNA pointed straight back to the very same continent, the very same Middle Passage as the people working in their fields. April Ellison was born a slave. Coin was born a slave. John Carruthers Stanley, one of the largest black slaveholders in North Carolina, was born a slave. The genome does not let any of them stand apart from the 4 million. It binds them right back into the same story, the same homeland, the same wound. They were not slavery's opposite, and they were not its equals in crime with the white planter class. They were slavery survivors, and a few of them, trapped in a system that offered no other ladder upward, climbed it on the backs of people who shared their own African blood. That is not a story that exonerates American slavery. It is close to the most damning thing you could possibly say about it. Let me be careful and exact about the limits here, because precision is the only thing that beats a weaponized myth. First, the numbers must stay in proportion, because proportion is everything here. We are talking about a few thousand free black slaveholders set against a system that held 4 million human beings in bondage, a fraction of a fraction. Most of those free black owners held family members they were straining to protect. A genuine commercial minority owned strangers for profit. Both facts are true, and the proportion between them is the whole point. To seize the rare exception and wave it around as if it were the rule is not history at all. It is propaganda, wearing history's clothes. Second, I want to be straight about the evidence, as always. There is no single dramatic DNA study of the black slave owners. What we have is the documented genealogical record, the census, the wills, the manumission petitions, the family reconstructions by historians like Mills and Rourke, and the DNA of descendants, which confirms the African origins and the family kinship the paper trail describes. The genome roots these families in Africa and reveals who was truly kin to whom. The fuller story of how and why lives in the archives. Third, and most important, nothing here erases the enslaved people who suffered under black masters, and nothing here lightens the crime of the men of any color who owned human beings for profit. Holding the full truth means holding all of it at once. The husbands buying their wives, the planters working their slaves, the African woman in chains whose grandchildren became planters themselves, and the towering white-built system that authored every bit of it. What survives is this: the black slave owners were never the clean rebuttal they have been turned into. They were a small, trapped, complicated people, most of them protecting family, a few of them exploiting it, all of them survivors of the very thing they are now used to excuse. So let's bring it home, because the real story is so much heavier and so much truer than the slogan. The next time someone lays down that trump card, black people own slaves too, you will know what the card is actually hiding. You will know that most of those owners were buying their own husbands and wives and children out of a bondage the law would not otherwise lift. You will know that the famous exceptions, the Ellisons and the Matoyers who really did own others for profit, were themselves the children and grandchildren of the enslaved, born in chains or one step removed from them, climbing the only ladder a merciless system left standing. And you will know that every one of them, no matter how rich, still needed a white man's permission to exist, still sat in the back pew, still felt the ground shift toward danger the moment white power decided it was done tolerating them. That is where the DNA finally lands. It takes the figure the myth uses to divide us, the black slave owner, the gotcha, the supposed proof that it was never really about race, and it traces him straight back across only a generation or two to an African woman in chains, to the same coast and the same crossing and the same wound as everyone else in the story. The truth was never that some black people had simply chosen the other side of a fair fight. The truth is that there were no sides on offer to them at all, only a cage with a few inches of headroom at the very top, and a system cruel enough to take a handful of its own victims and make them, for a single generation, into its tools, before it turned on them too, The black slave owners were never who we were told they were. They were not the rebuttal. They were us, caught in the worst trap this country ever built, some of them protecting the people they loved, a few of them lost inside it. And the honest telling of their story does not divide the descendants of the enslaved against one another. Traced all the way down, through the records and the blood, it brings every last one of them back home.